substantially and quickly change behavior. Credit to the Europeans for the very high fuel taxes, because that encourages much more fuel-efficient automobiles. As we look at moving eventually to electric vehicles, which will offer substantial improvements in greenhouse gases, we need the right policies in place to encourage those investments. The build-out of infrastructure, we're, as you can tell from the portfolio of businesses GE is in, we're an infrastructure company, whether it's aviation, power generation, locomotives, water treatment, healthcare. 80% of the infrastructure over the next 20 years is going to be built in developing countries like Indonesia. And there need to be policies to encourage the procurement of energy-efficient, emissions-friendly equipment. Buying at the lowest possible initial price almost guarantees you're not going to get that kind of equipment. So policies have to be put in place to get the kind of right behavior in that area.
Okay, let's see if we have a few questions in the audience. Anybody who's got some thoughts or a question they'd like to ask the panel on how do we accelerate change to create deep change in businesses and cut emission, create the low carbon economy? Not all at once, please. So please, the gentleman over here. If you can introduce yourself.
My name is Avi Sahi. I'm with Nike Sustainable Investment Lab. And I would invite the panel to expand, if you would, on what you're witnessing and what you might stimulate with respect to a comment that was made earlier on the topic of waste streams being created in the way we're already doing things being significant. There's many different waste streams that could potentially be repurposed with different innovations coming into being integrated into how manufacturing is done. Part of it is consumer, part of it is industrial, where one company's waste can be the feedstock for another company. Outside of the agricultural sector, it would be insightful to know how the different corporates are thinking about waste streams as it relates to their different business units, and what type of ideas or opportunities are you seeing around that, either on an absolute basis or potentially, to your earlier point, by partnering with other corporates. Is there a way to find something, for example, in aerospace that applies to consumer goods, or in medical that applies to another industry? It would just be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll take a crack at that question. It's certainly a good one. I'll try to answer the second one first, but you're exactly right. There's a lot to be learned from the aerospace industry. The most fuel-efficient engines made by far are for aircraft engines for planes, and so we take that technology and drive it into our power generation business. So some of that is happening today. Another a great example of converting waste to wealth, if you will, is are taking these huge landfills that we have around the world, but particularly in developing markets, and capturing the methane gas that comes out of the organic waste as part of that. Methane gas, as you probably know, is 20 times more harmful to the environment than CO2. We've got a number of exciting projects, including here in Jakarta and in Bali and in Manila, where we're working with partners to capture the methane gas coming off of landfills and convert that using highly efficient gas engines into electricity that gets sold to the grid. So instead of emitting it into the atmosphere, convert it to wealth. Very, very exciting. I think we're doing about 10 megawatts today, and that'll grow significantly over the next few years.
I would say in China, the interesting opportunity is not in individual companies but really looking at whole industrial parks that we're building at a time. So there's at least 50 science parks across China, and at least as many industrial parks, and similarly we have something called economic development zones. A lot of these are being built from scratch today, and so if we can design them in a way that there's a marketplace within these parks to utilize waste streams, I think that this is the interesting opportunity because it gives you scale. So for example, one of our students is building an industrial park in Xi'an. They would like it to be green, and part of that is looking at how do you reuse waste. The other interesting thing in China is that they're really looking at waste as one of the top, probably two most serious topics today. The first one is water, and the second one is municipal waste management. And so there will be a policy coming out, I think in the next month, on a national level, and they're trying to learn from other countries about how to price and how do you handle hazardous waste, etc. Our June training for 10 days for mayors is specifically on wastewater and waste management. So we'll be also having a US DOE come and talk about landfill to methane. So I think, again, in China, because of the scale and because we're building things from scratch, there's opportunities to experiment with things like that.
To follow up on that, Peggy, in China we are also more and more putting up factories in these large industrial parks. And instead of every individual company putting up their wastewater treatment plant, we're now starting to see that there is one massive wastewater treatment park for all its customers. Now, this really
it's a commune for corporations.
Yeah, and it's very efficient. Yeah. And so we're looking at that. But also, for instance, you mentioned water. I'm convinced that this Earth is running out of water before we're running out of oil. It's that serious when it comes to water. And in the coffee business, the farmers, they pick the cherries, then they have to be washed. We've been able, through new techniques, to reduce water consumption by 65% of what it used to be. For each individual farmer, it's very little. But if you look at the entire industry worldwide, this is very significant. And so there's an enormous amount of technological advances taking place to tackle waste. And I think the industry is doing the right thing.
But I think we're talking about how do you create transformational change. What I see over and over again is the lack of a convener to bring all the stakeholders across the supply chain to have a conversation about cradle to cradle. And so that's where NGOs like World Wildlife Fund and JUICE and other catalysts can come in and talk about the raw materials back to the waste and then back to the raw materials. But those are the conversations that we need to be having more of if we're really going to have change. Not individual technologies, not individual policies, not individual stakeholders, but the entire supply chain.
I think we have time for one more question if there's anybody in the audience. Gentleman over here in the middle.
Yes, thank you. My name is Kasim Ghazali. We are in the business of renewable energy solutions in Indonesia. I find the examples from Peggy very interesting, with regards to what you have been doing in China on a big scale. And it seems to